If you ask me if Boomio is oversaturated, I'd say yeah, it's oversaturated with bloody great videos to help little McScrubbin juniors like you get better at the old counter forces. Like, I actually saw a video there today, which was an interview that Adren, the former iBuyPower player, did with a sports psychologist. So check yourself before you wreck yourself mentally, like Oscar, the Czech Republic player, did in Mouse Sports, where he joined up with the team and then it didn't all work out because he had some sort of issues personally. So we're talking about oversaturation in esports, though. Now, it's a video I referenced in a topic I referenced in a past video where I did it more in the general context of, at the time, it was CSGO, it was StarCraft 2, it was Dota 2, where people kept complaining about oversaturation, from players to commentators to fans, like there's too many tournaments, we're seeing these players too much, like it loses some of its appeal. And anyone who knows my particular philosophy on this topic, I don't buy that at all. I mean, I love the games that I follow. I like to watch them. I like to watch them all day. I like to watch the best teams play over and over again. I don't get bored in that particular way. So to me, I'm coming from a different worldview. I'm the hardcore fan or observer or enthusiast aficionado. I think the more casual person is the one that gets bored of it, and they want it to be more of a soap opera aspect or more of a spectacle in one big tournament to make it easier for them so they feel like they didn't miss out on anything. But in Counter-Strike, I continue to hear over the years the topic come up again and again. And this is just crazy to me because, okay, sure, at the end of last year, I'll grant you that on the surface, it looked like the scene was oversaturated. I mean, think of some of the tournaments we had. In September, we had Star Series Season 2. We had DreamHack Bucharest. Going to October, E-League Season 2 began. We had Epicenter. We had EPL Season 4, so we had 3 big tournaments pretty much going on that month. Then you go into November, we've got IEM Oakland. Then we had ECS Season 2. In between that, E-League Season 2 finishes. We had the major qualifier as well. We had the minor. Actually, let me think. Yeah, we had all these tournaments going on. So people are going to look at all that and say, that's oversaturation. That's events every week. That's so many events in a month. The problem is, when it is presented and people talk about oversaturation, what they always say is they say this, oh, what happens is you just see every top team playing like every week or two at a LAN, and teams sometimes have to do 3 big LANs in a month, and you just see the same teams playing against each other week to week to week, and so no one cares anymore. The scene is oversaturated. We should have less events. Now, the problem with that is, okay, that extreme period I described towards the end of last year, yes, in that period, we did have a bunch of those tournaments that had the same teams in. But actually, they weren't even at all those tournaments. There was a whole bunch of them there where you had some teams didn't qualify if it was online qualifiers. Some teams went to the first couple, then skipped out a bunch. I mean, Virtus.pro famously took some of the latter ones off. They didn't qualify for ECS, didn't qualify for EPL. They took off IEM Oakland. There's only a few teams really went ham and tried to attend them all. Cloud9, you could put maybe Optic in the mix there. Astralis obviously had just got a new player and they were finally good again, so they wanted to go to them all. You had FaZe in the mix there. You had Dignitas obviously later to become North. In general, though, a bunch of teams didn't go. Like teams like Envious didn't always qualify. They didn't always make it there. Mouse Sports were up and down as to whether they'd make it to some of these tournaments. If they did, they might go out early. Therefore, they didn't have that much strain on them at the tournaments. Teams like Heroic wished they could go to all these tournaments, but weren't in position to necessarily qualify, even though they were a good upset team. So that's actually one of the points I want to make, is that it's not the case that we had this exaggerated perception that it was the same top teams at every tournament, every week, and we had that. There's very few teams actually did all 3 tournaments that were in that month of October, for example. E-League Season 2, Epicenter, APL Season 4. Now, there were some smaller lands. There was the Northern Arenas of the world. There was iBuyPower Masters. But those were smaller in nature entirely. Those weren't the elite teams. They were maybe the odd elite team that was from that region. And those were entirely optional to attend. Those weren't going to get massive exposure anyway. So if someone attends those tournaments, that's between them and their team. There's no obligation to do that. And all the fans weren't watching those tournaments anyway. In fact, even among these tournaments I've just listed now, like DreamHack Bucharest, that wasn't quite as big a tournament. Yeah, it had VP there, and Dignitas was getting very good, but that's about it. Beyond that, it didn't have the other big names. It didn't have your Navis, your SK Gamings, didn't have NIP, etc. there. You go over to other tournaments later in the year, ECS, the actual teams that qualified for that, they weren't as sick. It wasn't some of the best teams of the year. You go to EPL Season 4, you didn't have VP, you didn't have Navi. A bunch of these tournaments didn't have the biggest names at them, and that's a key point I want to make here, which is that having a big LAN circuit like we have now, and even last year in probably the most extreme example of that period, it gives teams a chance to play. So you actually get to see some of the names from in 3 out of the 4 tournaments or 2 out of the 4 tournaments, but you don't get to see them all. And that's a key point to remember when you're talking about oversaturation. If you limit the number of tournaments, you're going to see some of the teams play way less. Then when teams don't qualify for offline play, or they don't get invited, or they turn down an invitation, now you might not see that team play for a month and a half, for 2 months. You might have tournaments between them. You'll see other teams play each other, but you won't see that team play. And that's a problem, because I actually do want to live in a world where most of the big tier 1 tournaments, the $250,000 or more tournaments, have like the top 5 teams there. And that doesn't actually happen that often, because some of these are offline LAN finals. Some of them are invite only, but it's only going to be European teams at this one and North American teams at this one. It's not the same way. And so actually we need more tournaments to get to see all these teams play throughout the whole circuit. And that's what's good, is that actually some of these tournaments not being the biggest, or being big but using online qualifiers, means that you actually get into a world where you get different combinations of them all. So like, okay, that's why SK Gaming not winning EPL Season 4 was a huge deal, because there wasn't any VP, there wasn't any Na'Vi there, and they were in a position where they should be able to beat the NIPs and the C9s of the world and take that title if they're still a potential number 1. They didn't do it, and they're still a very good team, but that was a telling factor there, and we got to see Cloud9 upset them, whereas if Cloud9 had to upset SK, but also later on beat VP and Na'Vi, yeah, it probably doesn't happen, right? You don't get the same storylines, you don't get the same flavour, and this period we're heading into now is a perfect example of that. Because we've got a whole bunch of lands coming up. We've got CS Summit is this weekend. We've got DreamHack Austin. We've got DreamHack Tours. Go look at the fields for those tournaments. CS Summit, SK is the only vaguely elite team at it. But they have a whole bunch of the middle teams that would be like positions 9 to 15 in the rankings. So we get to see those teams battle against each other and then see who's better out of those. What happens when you put the head-to-heads there? And what happens when some of them compete against the NIPs and the SKs of the world? Then you got like DreamHack Tours. Yeah, it has the French teams and it has some other teams, but it doesn't have all the elite teams. It doesn't have the kind of lineup of Star Series and of DreamHack Vegas and the Major. DreamHack Austin has even less teams. It's mainly North American based, obviously, with obviously the odd threat team thrown in there, Brazilians, etc. So we're going to get to see a different flavour of tournament and different kind of competition, because the levels of competition are different and it's different lineups of teams. So the matchups are quite crucially different. And this is another point to make, because if we have less tournaments, then failure to qualify for the tournaments will also kill the exposure level of some of the other teams out there. Remember, if you're the biggest teams in the world, if you're the Astralis, the VP, Na'Vi, yeah, you probably will get invitations to a lot of these tournaments. You can just go and attend if you want to, assuming it's not one that you have to qualify for. But there are still some spots that are made up by qualifiers, and you have to have the Fanatics of the world qualify, or a G2 qualify, like these teams had to qualify for Star Series Season 3. Otherwise, you wouldn't have seen those teams there. So with less chances, that not only means that you're going to see those teams there less often, because there's less tournaments, but sometimes in those online qualifiers, they're going to get upset. And that's part of the problem. Because you saw this especially in NA. Teams like, think of some of the past tournaments we've had this year. CLG, Complexity, Renegades. These teams have beaten out bigger names that would have gone to these tournaments, like Team Liquid, and that you haven't seen some of those bigger names at the tournaments because of upsets in the online qualifier. So make it so there's only 1 or 2 chances to qualify online, and then those upsets become even more detrimental to seeing the biggest names go to the offline forum, because we know online and offline, very different affair. So you're going to give those good teams a lot of chances online to qualify. In EU, we know the likes of Mouse Sports and Hellraisers, no matter what the lineups are like, have had upset potential. Hellraisers, who end up finishing top 4 at Star Series, only got there because they upset Envious. I mean, admittedly, Hellraisers is a better online team, but Envious has bigger names, has a bigger name as a team, and so what happens if Envious doesn't even get that chance? And Hellraisers beats someone else out. Let's say Hellraisers had beaten a Fnatic or something. Now you don't see Fnatic at the tournament suddenly. See, it's not as simple as having what we like now and everything's going to be perfect. There's already flaws in the system that having more opportunities almost corrects, as it were, or gives you more opportunities for the things you want to see occur that otherwise wouldn't if it was 1 or 2 chances as opposed to 4 or 5. Then you've got to consider, we already don't see some of the elite teams over the last 2 years compete at these big lands. So when you have ECS finals and EPL finals, we know that famously, Na'Vi and VP, 2 of the best teams in the world over the last year and a half, don't make it to these LAN finals. It's rare that one of them makes it And it pretty much never happens that both of them make it. And in fact, right now, VP continues that trend and will not be making it to like EPL and likely ECS, etc. It's just continued the whole way. So if you want to see those amazing teams, you've got to have more lands so that they can play there. And that already means that the LAN finals for these leagues, the online leagues, aren't going to have them in them anyway. So they're going to be a different variety of teams. And other teams that might not beat a VP, like a North or something, they're going to get their shot to potentially win that. And with a lesser field, we also get to see what they're made of. Kind of like with the SK example for CS Summit that I talked about before. So it's worth pointing out that because some of the offline events already are the LAN finals for these big online leagues, we have like 2 of them every year, EPL and ECS, that already as a tournament format will never have all the best teams anyway, because first of all there's the online component, so some of them don't qualify. You get the Mouse Sports of the world and Hellraisers who beat out these teams and qualify. In the past it was FaZe before they got Nico and Carrigan who could sometimes qualify for these LANs. But beyond that, since they're regionally based, so half the field's NA, half the field's EU, already you're not getting all the best teams. If the best teams in the world, like 8 or 9 of them are European in the top 10, you already cannot have that many of them at these events. They don't have enough. They tend to have 12 teams or 8 teams make it to the finals. So you're only going to get 4 European or 6 European. You're already going to be missing some of the teams and, crucially, missing some of them playing each other, which is what the exaggerated version of oversaturation is, that they all play each other every week. No, we don't get to see them battle off sometimes, and we don't get to see the matchups we want. One of the great things about Counter-Strike, I think, is that you don't just see VP versus SK once in the playoffs of the one big tournament of the year. You get to see them play 3 or 4 times, and as we've seen in examples like those matchups, it gets better when that happens. Think about when we saw SK versus VP at those 2 majors, and VP pushed them, but SK just came out on top, won the 2 majors, then they went to ESL 1 New York, played a 3rd time. Did you all think, oh, not this matchup again, this is boring. Who wants to see this matchup, right, guys? No. I imagine, like me, you watched those first 2 maps and thought, Jesus fucking Christ, this is some of the best Counter-Strike I've ever seen in a match. And that's because they played so many times, and there was the mind games and the pressure of knowing what had happened in the past and battling to get back those close losses that you had before and turn them into wins like VP did and win that series and go to the final. And that made it more meaningful that they were able to get that win in that particular series. And then they played Epicenter and the other occasions that they played each other. And we again had epic matchups. So I actually think the biggest problem in terms of oversaturation, because I do think that there is an element of oversaturation that exists now in Counter-Strike, the biggest and primary factor, the primary person to be blamed for oversaturation is online play. Because you have to qualify through these big online leagues to make it to those LANs, to make it to the EPL finals, to make it to the ECS finals. If they were just events and you got invited, you could choose the ones you want to attend, you could turn down the other ones. But for these tournaments, these big finals, you have to play most of the time when you're not at other LANs. In the online matches, which you have to play many, the seasons last quite long, you have to play loads of matches, and you can't just skip them, because what if you don't get invited to a tournament later because your level goes down in terms of results? You want to give yourself every chance to go to big tournaments that you can, and your organization wants you to play in these leagues, because just as the tournament organizer designs the league online to have lots of matches and last a long time, so he can get a lot of exposure but for not much investment, contrasted against putting on $1 million event, so your team owner wants you to play in these online leagues, not just to represent your team at the offline finals and maybe win prize money, but because he can sell to his sponsors, you're going to get this many hours of them playing in the best leagues, and they're going to be playing in front of fans and playing other fan favorite teams, twice a week or whatever it might be. He can sell those metrics and those viewer hours to then have the sponsor logos on his team's jersey or in the name or whatever it might be, or market through their social media. This is big for the team owners and the tournament organizers, having these online leagues. It's part of what makes it's their bread and butter. It's the real money maker for both the organizers and the teams to an extent in terms of exposure, guaranteed exposure, in contrast to going to a LAN where sometimes you go out on day one, you don't get as much exposure, and you didn't get necessarily the biggest casting duo, or if there's double streams, you're not always on the streams. It's not the same kind of business in that particular sense. And so the business of esports at the moment almost requires these online leagues, but they're the biggest criminal factor, the biggest person to be blamed for the online oversaturation, because they're the least important matches ultimately. They're the ones that are throwaway, they are the online matches, they are the ones that take place every week, and yet those are the ones filling up the calendar beyond the teams going to the offline events. Then you've got to consider, if there was just one online league, this might be acceptable, but there are 2 and they run simultaneously. So now we have teams playing in both leagues at the same time. We have teams trying to qualify to get into both leagues at the same time. We have teams being sold, and people are saying if you want the league spots, that costs you more. That's become a part of the way you price out your team and evaluate your team, put a valuation on it when someone wants to buy your squad from you. This has become big business. So the big problem is the online leagues have a huge impact on oversaturation, but they're an element that you actually can't cut out. Effectively, you can't. Maybe there could be a world where they battle each other and one wins and one loses and you have one online league. Now, I have my own qualms knowing how people in esports operate, that would be fair and that the way it would be done wouldn't just become a monopoly. That's a real concern. But at least it'd be less games to a degree. But then again, would it? Because knowing some of the people in esports, I know certain tournament organisers where if they won the battle of the leagues, they'd just say, right, I'm the number one league. Oh, did you think that meant less games? No, I'm going to have double the amount of seasons, or I'm going to have double the amount of games. And I'm just going to fill that little vacuum with the other league left with all my games. And I'm going to then, in a different abstract third-party context, talk about oversaturation. There should be less leagues. And, we really need to condense the product and make it more high quality and, quality over quantity. But then in their own little domain, let's take up all the space we can. Let's do the most events we can, do the longest league we can, and make our league the only thing that should matter. But everyone else is doing the same thing. But let's pretend like we're not working with them. We're just making our own thing as much as we can, taking up as much space, as much territory as we can in the tournament calendar landscape. So another aspect that isn't often considered is that nowadays you don't just qualify for a major. You don't just take your qualification from the last major and play there. We've got a whole cycle that goes around the majors. Smaller teams play in the minor, then they hope to get through the minor to make it to the qualifier. Then the qualifier, they meet teams that dropped out of the last major, and in the qualifier, then we have to battle to make it to the major. So before you even get to the major, some of the teams could have played 2 tournaments already. Even teams who make it to the major, half of them have already had to play an extra tournament on LAN to do that. Now, I like that system. I think it's good. I think it's better than having it be online play that determines these things. But it takes up more tournament time in the calendar. So we've got leagues, we've got this aspect for the cycle into the major. Then we've got all the tier 2, tier 3 LANs. It's optional if you attend them, but you can if it's regional to you. And sometimes people just want to because the tournament calendar's empty for that month. Then you've got finally the tournaments I care about, the ones that you care about, the ones we really want to watch, the tier 1 premium LANs, and not everyone even qualifies for those. So it's too simplistic to talk about oversaturation in Counter-Strike as though we have 20 events a year and all the top 10 compete at all 20, and there's one every single week, and there's never times where you have a month where you have, like now with DreamHack Tours and Austin and CS Summit, and that the same teams play every week. No, they do online in online play, and online play and online qualifiers is something that in terms of online play, it's massively oversaturated. But in terms of offline play and the series we care about and seeing enough opportunities for the big teams to make it there, to qualify for them, then to battle each other, I think of the tier 1 premier tournaments, there's enough. There's the right amount. And you've already seen that the market takes care of itself. When you get too many big tournaments that even have good money, you see a bunch of these DreamHack events get bumped, essentially. The big teams don't go to that one, or they don't go to CS Summit, or they don't go to DreamHack Tours, or they might not go to a future event that's a Northern Arena or whatever. They will naturally take care of that and skip some of them, and that gives a chance for lesser teams to compete. This is another element that people don't think about that I think is very important. I think it's cool as fuck that some of these teams like Epsilon can go over to China and compete in a tournament there and win $30,000 or $40,000 and play the best Chinese teams. And then last year they played the equivalent of what was Heroic. It was Team X at the time. Or they can play a couple of other Western teams. And those tournaments exist as well. We have a wide circuit where lots of teams can win prize money. There's lots of opportunity to upset online and qualify. And then if you're good enough teams, there's lots of chances for invites. And then there's the league system and the minor to major qualifier to major cycle. At the moment, this is a beautiful kind of open market of opportunity. And what teams do within that's up to them. Now, if you want to talk about overexposure and oversaturation, a lot of that also has to fall on the teams. Like, I understand why they have to compete in the leagues. I've just described there that really that's where the teams can make a lot of their money in terms of exposure and have guaranteed metrics to show their sponsors. But beyond that, they have to be a little bit wiser themselves in terms of which tournaments they turn down. Because a lot of them who complain about oversaturation, you'll see them attend 3 or 4 LANs in the year that weren't even the big LANs, that were just smaller ones. And either they're angle shooting to win a smaller LAN, like a DreamHack Bucharest, in which case, why are you then complaining? Like, think about how nuts it is. If you were to look at the event as a whole a year, like they're doing when they talk about oversaturation, there's no logical reason as to why a VP would go and win a DreamHack Bucharest over IEM Oakland. IEM Oakland, a much better field, bigger prestige, I think even more prize money. So why did they go to Bucharest and not Oakland? because they weren't thinking that way. They were thinking like everyone else, week to week, month to month. So when it was the period around DreamHack Bucharest, there was only a couple of tournaments that month. It was after the player break. They were fresh, they were informed, they wanted to go there, they won that tournament. But later in the year when IEM Oakland came along, they'd had the stretch of a bunch of tournaments. They thought they might qualify for ECS. They thought they might need time off to prepare and recharge the batteries, so they skipped one of the big events of the year. And that's the whole point. If teams themselves can't even think on this larger scale, and tournament organisers definitely don't and won't work with each other in this respect, then who exactly are they complaining to about oversaturation? Who is going to fix it? Now, people will say, Valve should come in and do it. That would be the worst thing that could happen. Because what if Valve comes in and this tournament organiser X catches Valve's ear and they tell him, like, kick all the rest of the tournaments, I'll be the premier ones. Is that really what you want? Do you want to have one or two tournaments be the only circuit that get all the tier 1 teams? Is that some sort of reasonable scenario? At the moment, there is opportunity. People like PGL now have the major, where they were a tournament that had to battle their way up through the DreamHacks and the ESLs, and MLG likewise came up through that, and they got their own major as a result of doing it and doing a good job on North American soil. There's opportunity right now. There's chances for tournaments to become great and to succeed against their rivals. And I don't want Big Daddy Valve to come in and just give everything to the people currently, the status quo, the current hegemony at the top, and say, fuck all these little tournament organisers, no space for you in the scene, mate. No, if they can really innovate and be entrepreneurs and startups and make a bigger event or a cooler event or do something like CS Summit's doing, where it's a unique format, and yeah, they don't have the best teams, but it's something we haven't seen in CSGO at this kind of level. That's interesting. I want the opportunity for that to exist. And I don't think over-exaggeration exists in that sense. As a final thing to say on this topic, I hate the sports model that is in the sports I love, like the NHL, like the NBA, like the NFL. Because in these sports, you have the long season. So it's the equivalent of only having online play for 4 or 5 months of the year. Then you have the one playoff run. And the one playoff run dictates everything. So as a result, you essentially get one shot per year to prove you were the best, to win the ultimate prize. Now, one shot per year, even in a career that could last in the NFL 10 years, in NBA 20 years, if you're lucky, what about 15 years? In the NHL, if you're incredibly lucky, it can last 25, 30 years. Even in these scenarios, 10 chances isn't that many to prove that you were the best team or whatever. That's not as many. In Counter-Strike, you might get 50 chances to show that. And that's great. Because then you can be like VP and lose loads of majors, but you still won that one big one. And you still won some other big tournaments that proved you were relevant and proved that you could get back to the top again. You can be NIP and lose a ton of tournaments, but you can come back and have that flash and win that big one, where it might not happen if there was only one big tournament a year and everyone would think, oh, they were just losers for 4 years. No, I don't think that's reasonable. So when you have one big playoff run, that's less chances for greatness. There's less chances for players to show they're great and to have extra opportunities to battle each other and to learn and adapt from what they did before. In Counter-Strike, we don't have to worry about that. We don't have the variance of one playoff chance, one playoff run, 3 series to prove how great you are. We have 2 to 3 world championships a year. Then we have other big tournaments per year that you can battle in. Imagine if every year of Counter-Strike had one big tournament at the end of the year, one massive LAN, and the winner of that is the best team of the year. So, okay, I'll give you an example. What we'll do is we'll say that the winner of the last major of each of the big years of Counter-Strike was the best team of the year, and see how that matches up with what you know about history from seeing a fantastically wide open tournament circuit. So 2013, it was won by Fnatic. They were an underdog team. They hadn't won any big tournaments that year, and it was even considered a massive upset that they won the final over NIP. Especially because Very Games were in the mix in the semi-finals. If they'd have made the final, they'd beaten Fnatic many times. So that would mean Fnatic would be called, the world champions of 2013. They were in no sense the best team, even after winning that major. That was a year that was dominated by NIP, and then after them, Very Games. And then the drop-off to Fnatic is big, even after winning the major. Okay, let's go to 2014. Remember who won the last major of 2014? Well, it was LDLC, right? LDLC wasn't the best team of the year. LDLC wasn't the best team in the world. At the beginning of the year, NIP was initially the best, and then VP won a major, but VP wasn't the best, and then NIP took over as the best again until halfway through the year. And then in the latter part of the year, Fnatic and LDLC both started to come on strong, and at the end of the year, it was Fnatic for the last 2 or 3 months. But LDLC won the major, so LDLC would be the best team of the year. It's ridiculous, right? Let's go to 2015. So remember, 2015 is the best one because the first 2 majors were won by Fnatic. 2015 was part of the Fnatic era, right? You remember that? But who won the last major of the year? Envious. after the French Shuffle, the second major they'd played, they won that one. So imagine saying Envious, and not only that, not the better Envious in my opinion, the one with Shocks and with Smiths, the Envious with Kenny S and Apex, which was pretty good for like 2 months and then dropped off. That's the best team of the year. There's no Fnatic era, it's Envious's era. Now let's go to 2016. SK wins. Fine. There's actually one of the only ones that is actually reasonable, that they are clearly the best team of the year. So, oversaturation, it exists in some respects, but there's some which we can't, or people refuse to actually change because it's integral to the business of the sport. And then the other aspects, I think it's only when people look at the big picture and they don't consider the finer details that you get more teams at the circuits, you give more opportunities for greatness, you give teams a chance to not just get upset online. There's the online factor, where online leagues mean some of the best teams don't qualify, so you want to see them play more than 3 or 4 times a year, right? There's the aspect that there's the minor cycle and the way that all works out. It's not as simple as just saying there's oversaturation and less tournaments is the solution.
Hey guys, Memphis here. Just a friendly Canadian reminder to keep force spying, and you're watching Thorin's YouTube.